banned from returning to his own country. The announcement was delivered with the kind of quiet finality that left staffers and courtiers stunned. There were no fanfares, no public warnings, no room for negotiation. Just a decision, a line drawn, and an unmistakable message from the throne. King Charles had ended all of Harry's privileges, stripped him of protections, and warned him that from this point forward, every action he took would carry consequences. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. At first, it seemed almost surreal. Harry had been part of the British royal family his entire life, a figure groomed under the gaze of the world. He had grown up within the gilded halls of palaces, attended royal events from a young age, and participated in traditions steeped in centuries of history. Yet now, he was being treated not as a prince, not as a family member, but as someone who had overstepped, someone who had crossed an invisible but unyielding line. The question on everyone's mind was simple, yet terrifying. What could Harry have possibly done to provoke this unprecedented move? To understand why this moment was so seismic, we need to take a step back and look at the patterns that led here. Harry had always been a headliner, a magnet for media attention, both beloved and scrutinized. As a young man, he was the playful, mischievous prince, the younger sibling who seemed untouchable. But adulthood brought with it increasing tension between him and the monarchy. Every interview, every public statement, every carefully framed social media post was dissected, analyzed, and interpreted as either an act of defiance or an honest expression of personal truth. Harry had tried to chart his own course, but what the palace perceived as defiance, the world sometimes applauded as courage. And now, that very path he had chosen had led to a moment no one saw coming. What made this ban so compelling, so dramatically charged, is the timing. Only weeks before, Harry had attended high-profile events in the United States, delivering interviews that reignited old controversies, raising questions about loyalty, accountability, and family honor. Each headline seemed designed to provoke, to capture attention, to maintain relevance. But in doing so, he inadvertently escalated a private dispute into a public crisis. King Charles, who had long been measured in his responses, finally reached a breaking point. It wasn't a decision made lightly. It was a calculated move, signaling that actions have consequences, even for a prince. Many might ask, why now? Why, after years of public scrutiny, private disagreements, and media drama, did this moment finally arrive? The answer lies in a combination of personal betrayal, public perception, and the slow buildup of frustration within the palace. Sources indicate that meetings between Harry and the king had become increasingly tense, with advisors urging restraint on both sides. There were letters exchanged, phone calls made, and private conversations that reportedly ended in frustration, tears, and anger. Yet, despite these attempts to manage the situation quietly, Harry's public actions were impossible to ignore. They painted a picture of a prince out of step with the institution he was born into. To add another layer of complexity, the ban isn't merely symbolic. It comes with immediate consequences. Revoked security, loss of royal protection, withdrawal of access to palaces, and the stripping of ceremonial privileges. For Harry, this is not a simple rebuke. It's a profound upheaval of his life. Imagine being cut off from the very structures that defined your identity from birth. For a man who has relied on both familial and public trust, the implications are devastating. And while Harry's supporters in the media and abroad may frame this as a harsh response, the palace sees it as a necessary assertion of authority, a reminder that no one, not even a prince, is above accountability. Public reaction has been intense and immediate. Social media exploded with speculation, heated debates, and a flood of opinions. In America, commentators debated Harry's next moves, weighing in on whether he would retaliate, retreat, or try to negotiate. In the UK, citizens expressed shock, outrage, and even schadenfreude, depending on their perspective. The combination of international scrutiny and domestic tension created a volatile environment, where every report, rumor, and leak was amplified, and every decision was dissected under the relentless glare of public attention. But what makes this story even more gripping is the human element, the personal side of the royal drama. Behind the headlines, Harry is confronting a reality that few could have imagined. The family he grew up with, the titles he held for his entire life, the privileges that afforded him security and status, they are now gone. The pressure is not merely political or ceremonial, it is deeply emotional. It forces questions about loyalty, identity, and the cost of independence. How does a man reconcile his desire for freedom with the expectations imposed by tradition and bloodline? How does he face the consequences when the very institution he sought to critique or escape now controls his access, safety, and reputation? Amid this upheaval, there are whispers, rumors of secret meetings, letters withheld from public knowledge, and behind-the-scenes conversations that would shock anyone. Some suggest that key advisors and family members were pushed to their limits, forced to choose between supporting Harry or defending the monarchy's integrity. Others hint at private warnings that escalated to ultimatums, each more severe than the last. The tension is palpable, the stakes enormous, and the next move uncertain. Every day brings new revelations, each one raising questions that deepen the intrigue and keep the public riveted. This is not a story of simple family disagreement. It is a drama that combines power, loyalty, betrayal, and consequence. It is a narrative that spans continents, media platforms, and centuries of tradition. And while Harry's actions may have prompted the ban, the ripple effects touch every corner of the monarchy, forcing courtiers, advisors, and the public alike to confront uncomfortable truths about privilege, responsibility, and accountability. As we move into the unfolding chapters of this saga, you will witness the escalation of tensions, the calculated moves by both Harry and King Charles, and the ways in which private disputes have spilled into the public arena. You will see how every decision, every word, and every public appearance carries weight, and how the consequences of one prince's actions now resonate far beyond the palace walls. And you will begin to understand why this ban is not just about Harry. It is about the future of the monarchy itself, about the power of tradition, and about the limits of family loyalty when tested by fame, scrutiny, and scandal. It all began long before the ban. Long before the headlines screamed, Harry banned from UK. There were small fractures, subtle tensions, whispered disagreements in quiet corridors of the palace. But like a storm forming on the horizon, no one quite realized how quickly these cracks would widen into a chasm. And when that breaking point arrived, it arrived with the force of decades of unresolved tension, public scrutiny, and private resentment converging into a single, unstoppable moment. The palace, by design, is a place of ceremony, tradition, and control. Every gesture, every word, every appearance is carefully choreographed. Yet even in this environment of meticulous order, human emotion can override protocol. And for Harry, those emotions, anger, frustration, confusion, had been simmering for years. Childhood experiences of being watched, criticized, and compared to his older brother created a foundation of tension that would shape his decisions well into adulthood. But adolescence alone does not explain the breaking point. It was the accumulation of choices, missteps, and moments where personal desire collided with institutional expectation. Many insiders trace the exact moment when Harry's relationship with the monarchy shifted from tension to outright conflict to a series of incidents during his late 20s. There were interviews where he openly questioned the royal system, media appearances that appeared to undermine his family, and decisions that directly challenged tradition. Each of these moments was minor in isolation, yet collectively they painted a portrait of a prince increasingly unwilling, or perhaps unable, to conform to the unspoken rules of his world. The breaking point, however, was not simply a single public misstep. It was private. A confrontation in one of the palace's quiet meeting rooms. Courtiers later described the scene as tense, almost suffocating. Advisors whispered to each other in corridors, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Harry reportedly entered the room full of determination, his eyes blazing with the fire of someone who had decided he would no longer be constrained. King Charles, meanwhile, was calm but firm, exuding a presence that reminded everyone in that room who ultimately held power. Words were exchanged, some sharp, some pleading, some accusing. No cameras recorded this exchange, yet its impact would echo for years to come. One source close to the palace described Harry's demeanor that day as a mixture of defiance and desperation. He wanted to be heard, the insider said, but he didn't realize that in that room, being heard came at a cost. The cost, as it turned out, was more than just words. It was a shift in trust, a recalibration of relationships, and a realization for Harry that the monarchy could, and would, hold him accountable. Every misstep, every leak, every public statement that had previously seemed manageable suddenly became part of a narrative that painted him as reckless, ungrateful, and increasingly isolated. This chapter of Harry's life was marked by tension not just with King Charles, but with the larger royal institution. There were advisors who questioned his choices, friends who warned him of the consequences, and a media landscape that amplified every misstep. It was a perfect storm. Each day seemed to present a new challenge, a new headline, a new crisis. Harry's frustration mounted. He began to see the monarchy not as a protective institution, but as a cage, beautiful, golden, but suffocating nonetheless. And in this environment, a breaking point became inevitable. The public, of course, only saw the results of this tension indirectly. Subtle shifts in body language during royal events, statements that hinted at disagreements, and occasional leaks that suggested deeper issues behind closed doors. Few understood the scale of the internal strife. Palace staffers described it as a kind of slow-motion implosion. Decisions that once would have been routine, security protocols, public appearances, ceremonial duties, became fraught with tension. Every action Harry took was interpreted, analyzed, and often weaponized against him. But the breaking point also had a deeply personal dimension. Harry's relationship with his brother William, once close, had become strained. Small disputes over public duties escalated into larger questions of loyalty, perception, and identity. Every family event became a minefield, where unspoken expectations collided with personal desires. Advisors later noted that Harry often felt trapped between his love for his family and his need for autonomy, a tension that would ultimately fuel the confrontation that led to the ban. And then there were the public statements, interviews, and social media posts that fans and critics alike would later cite as evidence of his rebellion. Each post seemed innocent in isolation, but together they created a pattern that was impossible for the palace to ignore. Some analysts suggest that Harry may have underestimated the symbolic power of his actions, the way the monarchy interprets even private decisions as public statements. Others argue that he simply believed that honesty and openness were more important than protocol. Either way, the consequences were becoming unavoidable. By the time Harry left that fateful meeting, the trajectory was clear. The monarchy would no longer tolerate actions that challenged its authority, and Harry would face consequences that extended far beyond the personal. The breaking point was not a moment. It was a culmination, a perfect storm of emotion, misjudgment, and institutional rigidity. And in that moment, everyone involved knew that the path forward would be irrevocably altered. What followed in the weeks and months after that confrontation was a series of calculated moves by King Charles. Privileges were quietly reviewed, security protocols were adjusted, and advisors were instructed to prepare for a potential public fallout. Harry's world, once filled with comfort and certainty, began to shrink. Every title, every ceremonial role, every aspect of protection he had taken for granted was now subject to scrutiny and potential revocation. The breaking point, in essence, became the first act in a larger drama that would culminate in the ban. Yet even as the palace tightened its control, the human story remained central. Harry was navigating not just political consequences, but emotional ones. The loss of trust, the sense of betrayal, and the awareness that family loyalty has limits created a psychological pressure that few outside the palace could fully understand. And while advisors emphasized strategy and optics, Harry's personal reckoning was far more intimate and painful. The breaking point, then, was both public and private. It was the intersection of family tension, institutional authority, and personal choice. It set in motion a chain of events that would eventually lead to the revocation of privileges, the withdrawal of protections, and the shocking announcement that Harry was banned from the UK. But the full extent of the consequences was not yet known, and the next moves would test Harry, the monarchy, and the very idea of royal accountability in ways no one could predict. And just as Harry thought he might find a way to regain equilibrium, another revelation landed, one that would challenge everything he believed about family loyalty, privilege, and power. A private letter, a whispered warning, and a subtle shift in public perception combined to push him further toward a confrontation that the world would eventually witness in headlines that read like a drama scripted for centuries. The moment the palace announced it, the shock was immediate. Prince Harry's privileges had been stripped. Titles, ceremonial roles, and the very protections that had accompanied him since birth were suddenly gone. For most people, losing a privilege might mean a parking space or a club membership. For Harry, it meant the loss of identity, security, and a lifetime of entitlement carefully curated by centuries of tradition. The public may have seen it as headlines or social media soundbites, but behind the scenes, it was a profound personal upheaval that struck at the core of who he was. Titles are not just words in the royal family. They are symbols of authority, status, and belonging. For Harry, these titles had defined him from the moment he was born. From the Duke of Sussex to his ceremonial honors, each carried weight, recognition, and access. Losing them was more than a professional setback. It was an erasure of identity. Insiders note that in the immediate aftermath, Harry struggled to comprehend what had been taken. It's like being told you don't exist in the system you grew up in, one palace aide reportedly said. The titles, privileges, and roles were no longer just ceremonial. They were tied to his family, his history, and his public persona. And now, they were gone. Security, another cornerstone of privilege, was also revoked. Royal protection is more than bodyguards. It is a carefully orchestrated system designed to ensure the safety of family members under intense public scrutiny. For Harry, being stripped of security meant more than inconvenience. It meant vulnerability. Reports indicated that his movements were now monitored differently, that he would have to rely on private arrangements, and that any misstep could have real consequences. The palace made it clear, privilege had its boundaries, and stepping beyond them came with risk. Financial privileges were also affected. While Harry had amassed personal wealth through various means, certain financial supports tied to his royal status were no longer available. This includes allowances, sponsorships, and ceremonial funds that had previously cushioned his public and private life. For a man accustomed to operating within the protective bubble of wealth and status, this was a sudden reality check. Financial independence, while desirable, now came with a cost. Scrutiny, exposure, and responsibility that could no longer be mitigated by palace protections. The ceremonial aspect of privilege was equally significant. Harry could no longer participate in key events, from military ceremonies to public commemorations. Every absence, every revoked invitation, was a public reminder of his reduced status. The symbolism was stark, a prince in name only, cut off from the roles that gave him visibility and influence. For those watching from the outside, it may have seemed like a minor adjustment. But for Harry, it was a daily, tangible reminder of how quickly the structures that had defined him could be dismantled. Public appearances, once carefully curated and supported by palace staff, became fraught with difficulty. Without formal support, invitations were limited, logistical support withdrawn, and media attention increasingly critical. Insider accounts describe Harry's frustration. Every event became a potential trap, every appearance scrutinized for signs of disloyalty or defiance. The withdrawal of privileges created not just practical challenges, but a psychological burden. Harry was no longer insulated from consequences. He was exposed to them, fully and immediately. It wasn't only the tangible privileges that were lost, it was the implicit trust and respect that came with them. Courtiers, aides, and advisors who had once facilitated his life within the royal structure were now reassessing their loyalty. Relationships that had been shaped by hierarchy and privilege were suddenly recalibrated. Harry's ability to influence decisions, participate in policy discussions, or even access certain areas of the palace was restricted. Every interaction became a negotiation, every request a reminder of what had been taken. And yet, the stripping of privileges had another effect. It created a public spectacle. Headlines across the globe highlighted Harry's fall from grace, framing it as both punishment and scandal. Social media exploded with opinions, memes, and heated debates. Fans alternately defended him as a victim of a rigid system or criticized him as reckless and entitled. For the monarchy, this was a test of perception. How much could the public tolerate a prince who defied protocol and faced real consequences? For Harry, it was a lesson in visibility and vulnerability. The world was watching, and every reaction would be interpreted as either justification or guilt. Analysts note the psychological toll this takes. Privilege, while often invisible to the outside observer, creates a framework for behavior, expectation, and identity. When it is abruptly removed, the shock is more than practical, it is existential. Harry faced the challenge of redefining himself outside of a system that had structured his entire life. The symbolism of this stripping was intentional. It was a message to Harry and to anyone watching that titles, privileges, and protections are earned, maintained, and respected, not taken for granted. It was a demonstration of authority by King Charles, signaling that the monarchy would uphold its rules and boundaries, even with family members. Every revocation carried meaning, a subtle yet powerful reminder of hierarchy, tradition, and consequence. Yet, Harry's response to losing these privileges was complex. Sources indicate he initially struggled with denial and frustration, oscillating between attempts to reclaim influence and moments of introspection. He consulted advisors, strategized, and even considered public statements that might shift perception. But the palace remained resolute. The message was clear: privileges are not negotiable once the boundaries have been crossed. Every move Harry made was now subject to scrutiny, every step weighed against a backdrop of public expectation and royal authority. In the weeks following the announcement, Harry began to experience the real-life implications of losing his privileges. Security changes meant he had to rely on private arrangements. Travel became more complex, and access to official venues was limited. Financial adjustments forced him to reevaluate certain projects and commitments. Public appearances, once routine, required careful planning to avoid controversy. Each change, each adjustment, reinforced the gravity of the situation. The privileges he had once taken for granted were no longer safety nets. They were gone, leaving him exposed, scrutinized, and vulnerable. The stripping of privileges also had a dramatic emotional impact. Harry, accustomed to influence, support, and recognition, faced isolation. Former allies distanced themselves. Opportunities evaporated. Every reminder of what he had lost was a blow to ego, status, and confidence. Some advisors likened it to a rite of passage, forcing him to confront the consequences of choices he had previously skirted or underestimated. It was both punishment and instruction, a complex combination of authority and guidance that challenged Harry on multiple levels. And yet, the drama was far from over. Stripped of privileges, Harry's options were limited. But his desire to act, to respond, and to assert himself remained. This tension between restriction and initiative created a volatile environment, both within the palace and in the public eye. Every decision he made in the aftermath of losing titles, security, and access became a calculated risk. The stripped privileges were not just a consequence. They were a catalyst for the next stage of the unfolding saga. As the days passed, it became increasingly clear that Harry's life had changed irreversibly. The comforts, protections, and influence he had relied on were no longer available. The monarchy had made its point, asserting authority and setting boundaries. But the personal, public, and psychological consequences were just beginning to manifest. Every headline, every social media post, and every public appearance now carried heightened significance. Harry was navigating a world that had suddenly become far more precarious than he could have imagined. And yet, even in this constrained reality, whispers began to circulate, rumors of potential retaliation, behind-the-scenes maneuvers, and strategies to regain influence. The palace anticipated this. King Charles had made it clear, privileges stripped were not temporary. Every move Harry made would be closely monitored. The stage was set for the next dramatic chapter of the story, where consequences would escalate, and tensions would reach unprecedented heights. Behind closed doors, the palace was a different world entirely, a place where whispers carried weight, where glances conveyed unspoken threats, and where private meetings often shaped history long before the public ever heard a word. For Harry, These secret meetings were the crucible where his relationship with the monarchy was truly tested. Every encounter with King Charles, senior advisors, or key courtiers was high stakes. Every word, every pause, every gesture could either escalate tension or open the door to compromise. And as we now know, one of these meetings would become a turning point, an eruption of royal fury that would redefine Harry's life forever. It began as most meetings do, quietly, with a sense of formality masking the underlying tension. The atmosphere in the room was charged, like the air before a storm. Courtiers and aides positioned themselves carefully, aware that even the smallest slip could shift the balance of power. Harry entered with a mix of determination and defensiveness, fully aware that what happened here could determine his standing with his family and with the monarchy itself. King Charles, in contrast, was composed but resolute, a figure who had spent decades understanding both public perception and private loyalty. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be equal parts personal and institutional. Sources close to the palace described the opening moments of the meeting as tense but controlled. Advisors reported that Harry began by asserting his position, framing his actions as necessary for personal freedom and transparency. He spoke of his desire to live authentically, to speak openly, and to carve a path outside the confines of tradition. But each argument he made was met with measured responses, each highlighting the obligations, expectations, and historical responsibilities that came with his birthright. King Charles, ever mindful of precedent and protocol, emphasized that personal desires could not override duty, family, and the reputation of the monarchy. The conversation quickly escalated. What began as a discussion of principles devolved into a confrontation of loyalty and betrayal. Reports suggest that tempers flared, voices rose, and emotions ran high. Harry, frustrated by what he saw as rigidity and misunderstanding, pushed harder, emphasizing personal grievances and perceived injustices. King Charles responded with the weight of authority, articulating consequences for actions that undermined trust or defied protocol. Witnesses described the room as a pressure cooker where every comment reverberated like thunder in a confined space. At one point, the meeting reportedly turned sharply personal. Family loyalty, past sacrifices, and shared history were invoked in ways that struck at Harry's sense of identity. Advisors later described this as a critical juncture. Harry could either acknowledge the consequences and seek reconciliation, or double down on defiance and risk irreversible fallout. According to insiders, it was a tense standoff, with neither side willing to yield. The palace, as a centuries-old institution, operates on principles of hierarchy and order. For a prince to openly challenge these structures is rare and historically consequential. Adding fuel to the fire were the private leaks and rumors that had circulated in the weeks leading up to the meeting. The palace was aware that Harry's previous interviews, social media statements, and off-the-record remarks had already shaped public perception. King Charles, reportedly, was incensed not only by the actions themselves, but by the public spectacle they created. Every leak, every story, was interpreted as both a personal affront and a strategic misstep, undermining the monarchy's authority and reputation. The secret meetings, therefore, were not just about reconciliation. They were about damage control, assertion of power, and establishing boundaries. Harry's response during the meeting revealed both defiance and vulnerability. He argued that his autonomy was being unfairly restricted, that his public statements were honest, and that he had the right to shape his own narrative. But the palace countered with the weight of tradition, history, and responsibility, emphasizing that privilege comes with accountability. The clash was not merely about differing perspectives. It was a collision of identities, values, and expectations. For Harry, it was a fight for self-expression. For King Charles, it was a defense of institution and legacy. Sources describe moments of palpable tension, long pauses, piercing looks, and subtle gestures that conveyed as much as words. Advisors noted that Harry's frustration was compounded by the realization that no amount of explanation would immediately resolve the conflict. The monarchy operates on a system of precedent and authority. Emotional appeals alone could not override centuries of protocol. And yet, Harry continued to push, advocating for recognition, autonomy, and respect. The room became a theater of power, emotion, and strategy, where every move was scrutinized and every statement dissected. As the meeting progressed, the stakes intensified. King Charles reportedly issued clear warnings about the consequences of continued defiance. Privileges, security, and titles could be revoked. Public statements would be monitored and interpreted through the lens of loyalty and discretion. Advisors later confirmed that these were not idle threats. The monarchy had mechanisms in place to enforce accountability swiftly and decisively. For Harry, hearing this in a private, controlled environment was a shock. The reality of potential consequences, until that moment largely theoretical, became immediate and undeniable. This confrontation also highlighted the deep divide between perception and reality. Harry had often framed his actions as acts of honesty and personal expression, while the palace interpreted them as breaches of trust, challenges to authority, and threats to institutional stability. In the closed environment of the palace meeting room, these differences could not be mediated by public relations spin or sympathetic coverage. They were raw, unfiltered, and consequential. Every word mattered, and every decision carried weight far beyond the walls of the room. The emotional intensity of the meeting left lasting effects on all involved. Witnesses report that Harry left with a mixture of anger, frustration, and fear, a recognition that his actions had provoked a response he could neither ignore nor fully control. King Charles, in turn, emerged resolute, having established boundaries and articulated consequences clearly and decisively. The meeting, though private, set the stage for the public actions that would follow. The revocation of privileges, the withdrawal of protections, and the eventual ban from the UK. But the drama didn't end when the meeting adjourned. In the days that followed, advisors worked tirelessly to implement the decisions agreed upon. Security protocols were adjusted, and communications were carefully managed to prevent further leaks. Harry's team, meanwhile, struggled to navigate the new reality, balancing public image, private strategy, and personal emotion. Every interaction, from press statements to social engagements, was now conducted under the shadow of that meeting, an invisible but potent force shaping behavior, perception, and outcome. And yet, the most significant impact of these secret meetings was not practical, it was psychological. Harry, for the first time in his life, confronted the full weight of consequence. Titles, privileges, security, and status. All had limits, and all were contingent on trust, loyalty, and adherence to institutional expectations. The realization that the monarchy could assert power decisively and without hesitation was sobering. It forced him to reconsider strategy, alliances, and personal choices in a way that would ripple throughout every subsequent chapter of his life. The fury in the palace, the private confrontations, and the careful enforcement of boundaries were not mere theatrics. They were deliberate, strategic, and historically consistent responses by a monarch asserting authority over his family. King Charles had communicated a simple but powerful message: loyalty matters, boundaries matter, and privilege is conditional. For Harry, the implications were staggering, both a personal reckoning and a public warning. Even as Harry processed the confrontation, rumors of the meeting's intensity began to leak, subtly at first, then more widely. Analysts, journalists, and royal watchers speculated about what had been said, how it had been received, and what it meant for the future. Public interest surged. The palace, while maintaining official silence, knew that the impact would be magnified in the court of public opinion. Harry's actions, already scrutinized, would now be viewed through the lens of this private confrontation. And just when it seemed the private storm had run its course, an unexpected revelation emerged. A new letter, a subtle warning, or an overlooked detail that hinted at even greater consequences. It was a reminder that in the world of royalty, every action has a reaction, every choice carries weight, and no secret remains hidden forever. The secret meetings and the fury within them had set the trajectory, but the full consequences were only beginning to unfold. The confrontation had ended, but the battle was far from over. Every privilege stripped, every title threatened, every public statement scrutinized, the ripples from that meeting would define the next chapter of Harry's life. and the world would soon see just how far the monarchy was willing to go to enforce authority, preserve tradition, and respond to defiance. The palace had always maintained a delicate relationship with the media, a balance of control, influence, and occasional concession. Stories would leak, carefully curated statements released, and public perception subtly guided. But in Harry's case, the leaks became a weapon, and the weapon became a wildfire. Every whispered conversation, every private disagreement, every internal conflict began to seep into the public domain, igniting outrage and shaping the narrative in ways that neither Harry nor the monarchy could fully control. The first leaks were subtle, almost innocuous. Rumors of tense meetings, private disagreements, and disagreements over ceremonial duties surfaced in tabloids and royal correspondence columns. At first glance, they appeared minor, a disagreement here, a slight misstep there, but the cumulative effect was enormous. Each leak painted a portrait of discord, of a prince increasingly at odds with tradition and expectation. For the palace, this was alarming. For Harry, it was a confirmation of the very tensions he had felt privately, but now magnified on a global stage. The leaks intensified after the secret meetings with King Charles. Sources report that aides, whether intentionally or inadvertently, began sharing details with journalists. Every nuance of tone, every snippet of dialogue, and every emotional exchange became fodder for the press. Headlines splashed across newspapers and social media platforms, often exaggerating the severity of events for dramatic effect. One moment, Harry was challenging protocol. The next, he was cast as a rebel prince undermining centuries of monarchy. The line between truth and narrative blurred, and the public became the jury in a trial that had no formal courtroom. Social media amplified the effect exponentially. Within hours, every report was dissected, commented on, and shared thousands of times. Fans and critics alike weighed in, creating a digital storm that was impossible to ignore. For the first time, Harry's personal disputes became public spectacle, dissected with relentless scrutiny. Every post, every quote, every alleged leak became a flashpoint for debate, polarizing audiences worldwide. The palace, aware of the stakes, attempted to maintain silence. But in the age of viral media, silence itself was a statement, often interpreted as guilt, uncertainty, or concession. One particularly explosive leak involved details of Harry's private confrontation with King Charles. Though carefully redacted and anonymized, the report conveyed tension, anger, and threats of revocation of privileges. The media framed it as a dramatic standoff, a prince defying the throne, a monarch asserting authority, and a family divided in public view. Analysts later noted that this leak significantly shifted public opinion, portraying Harry as reckless while reinforcing King Charles's image as measured, decisive, and principled. The palace's fury was not only at the content, but at the audacity of the leak. An internal matter made external, intimate conflicts transformed into tabloid drama. Leaks also detailed Harry's responses to these private confrontations. Reporters described him as frustrated, defensive, and at times even defiant. Every gesture, facial expression, and carefully chosen word became a matter of speculation. For the public, it was irresistible. A peek behind the curtain at the human drama within one of the most scrutinized families in history. For the palace, it was a nightmare, undermining internal authority and forcing difficult decisions about how to contain the fallout. The leaks did not stop at personal confrontations. They extended into discussions of privileges, security, and ceremonial roles. Reports suggested that Harry's access to certain palaces, events, and protections had been under review, fueling speculation about punishment, banishment, or broader consequences. Even the smallest rumor about a meeting, a phone call, or a strategic decision was amplified, interpreted as evidence of conflict, betrayal, or drama. For Harry, the effect was double-edged. His private reality was being reflected back to him through a distorted lens, where perception often outweighed truth. Public outrage, once sparked, became a self-sustaining cycle. Every new leak fueled commentary, which prompted responses, which generated additional leaks. Social media algorithms amplified the drama, ensuring that every headline reached millions worldwide. Critics accused Harry of recklessness. Supporters decried palace rigidity. Each faction interpreted the leaks according to their own biases, creating a feedback loop of outrage, speculation, and moral judgment. The situation escalated faster than any controlled narrative could manage. The palace, for its part, faced its own challenge. Silence was necessary to maintain decorum, yet the absence of immediate responses allowed the narrative to spin unchecked. Internal advisors worked tirelessly to trace the source of leaks, tighten information security, and strategize responses, but the damage had been done. Public perception had shifted, and every subsequent move would now be interpreted through the lens of controversy. The leaks, intentional or not, had become a key player in the unfolding drama, shaping both Harry's actions and the monarchy's response. Harry himself reportedly struggled to manage the consequences. Sources indicate that he felt both exposed and misunderstood. Personal grievances, private intentions, and nuanced decisions were flattened into sensational headlines, leaving little room for context or explanation. The leaks forced him into a reactive position. Every statement, every decision, every public appearance had to be calculated not only for intent, but for interpretation. For a man used to influence and control, the sudden loss of narrative authority was deeply unsettling. Some of the most dramatic leaks hinted at larger truths. The unspoken tensions, strategic disagreements, and private threats that the public would never see fully. Analysts suggest that these leaks were both a symptom and a catalyst, a reflection of internal strife and a trigger for escalating consequences. Each revelation pushed the palace and Harry closer to a confrontation that was no longer avoidable. And as the leaks continued, the stakes rose. The palace recognized that public opinion could influence outcomes. Advisors became increasingly vocal, and the pressure on Harry intensified. Every article, every headline, every social media post contributed to a narrative that was spiraling beyond control. Harry's personal grievances, previously manageable in private, were now magnified in the court of global public opinion. The pressure was immense, and the consequences were imminent. By the time the palace made the decision to formally revoke privileges and announce restrictions, the groundwork had been laid by these leaks. Public outrage had built momentum, advisors had confirmed the necessity of action, and King Charles had made the calculated choice to assert authority decisively. The leaks had created a storm that could no longer be contained, and Harry found himself at the center. Exposed, vulnerable, and facing consequences that would forever change his relationship with the monarchy. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the leaks was psychological. Harry was forced to confront a reality where private disputes had public consequences, where every action could be weaponized, and where the world's judgment was relentless. The pressure of exposure, combined with the loss of privileges and strained family relationships, created an environment where even minor missteps could have outsized impact. The palace had achieved a dual purpose: control through consequence and influence through perception. As the chapter closed, one fact became undeniable. Media leaks had not just reported the story, they had helped write it. They had shaped public opinion, escalated tension, and forced the palace's hand. For Harry, the leaks were a reflection of a truth he had long sensed privately, but had never faced publicly. The moment of exposure, once unavoidable, had arrived. And in the shadows of headlines and hashtags, the next escalation was already taking shape, one that would push Harry further toward confrontation, consequence, and a dramatic reckoning with the institution he had been born into. The term ultimatum carries weight in any context, but within the walls of the royal palace, it is practically seismic. For centuries, the monarchy has operated on subtlety, protocol, and quiet influence. Ultimatums are rare, calculated, and only delivered when prior warnings, private discussions, and gentle nudges have failed. For Prince Harry, the royal ultimatum was more than a formal warning. It was the culmination of private confrontations, stripped privileges, and media storms. It was a line drawn in the sand. Cross it, and consequences would be swift, unyielding, and irreversible. The palace did not issue this ultimatum lightly. King Charles had spent weeks, perhaps months, observing Harry's behavior, evaluating the risks to both the monarchy and family cohesion. Advisors had compiled detailed reports of public appearances, interviews, social media posts, and leaked communications. Every statement Harry made was scrutinized, every interaction assessed for its potential to undermine authority or invite public controversy. The ultimatum was therefore not a sudden reaction. It was the calculated result of accumulated evidence, frustration, and institutional necessity. The meeting to deliver the ultimatum was described by insiders as tense and dramatic. Unlike previous discussions, this session was formal, structured, and recorded in detail by palace aides. Harry entered aware that the stakes were higher than ever. The room was deliberately controlled, a private setting where emotion could be measured, words documented, and authority asserted. King Charles, calm but resolute, began by reviewing the previous warnings, detailing how privileges had been stripped and emphasizing the consequences of continued defiance. The message was clear. The monarchy would tolerate no further challenges to protocol, loyalty, or discretion. Sources indicate that the ultimatum included several key components. First, Harry was warned that any attempt to act outside palace-approved channels would have immediate repercussions, ranging from further loss of privileges to formal restrictions on travel and access. Second, public statements criticizing the monarchy or revealing private family matters would be treated as breaches of trust with significant consequences. Third, the ultimatum included a subtle but unmistakable reminder that the monarchy's authority extends beyond titles. It encompasses perception, influence, and legacy. Every action, even outside the UK, would be considered within this framework. For Harry, the ultimatum was a shock on multiple levels. Privileges and access had already been revoked, but this formal warning was different. It was a public-facing reality, delivered privately but intended to influence perception, strategy, and behavior. The psychological impact was enormous. The realization that even personal actions could be interpreted as institutional defiance created a pressure that few could fully comprehend. Advisors later noted that Harry's demeanor shifted noticeably during the meeting, from defiance to defensive calculation, from frustration to contemplation. The weight of consequence had landed squarely on his shoulders. What made the ultimatum particularly striking was its timing. It came shortly after a series of leaks, media controversies, and private confrontations. The palace had watched as Harry navigated the fallout, assessing whether he would moderate behavior, seek reconciliation, or escalate defiance. The decision to issue the ultimatum indicated that the monarchy had concluded patience was exhausted. Privileges stripped, public narrative monitored, and private warnings delivered. Yet the response had not met expectations. The ultimatum was the next logical step, a controlled escalation designed to enforce boundaries decisively. Insiders also suggest that the tone of the ultimatum was deliberately firm, but not purely punitive. King Charles reportedly emphasized loyalty, responsibility, and family cohesion, framing the warning as both consequence and opportunity. The palace's message was unambiguous. Compliance could restore stability, reconciliation was possible, but defiance would bring escalating repercussions. For Harry, this framing presented a dilemma: submit to authority or risk further isolation and punishment. Every choice carried weight, every decision was scrutinized, and every misstep would be magnified. The public, unaware of the full content of the ultimatum, would soon feel its effects. Subsequent reports hinted at the severity of the warning, fueling speculation about Harry's next moves. Social media exploded with commentary, much of it speculative, framing the situation as either authoritarian overreach or necessary discipline. Headlines emphasized the drama, creating a perception of crisis that further amplified tension. The palace had effectively used the ultimatum as both a private enforcement mechanism and a public narrative device. A rare but potent strategy in royal management. In the days following the ultimatum, advisors worked closely with Harry to monitor behavior, manage communications, and navigate logistics. Travel plans, public engagements, and private meetings were now subject to heightened scrutiny. Privileges already stripped, combined with the ultimatum, created a reality in which Harry's actions were constrained and his options limited. Every move was strategic, every interaction carefully considered, and every statement potentially consequential. The psychological toll was immense, adding pressure to an already volatile situation. But the ultimatum also sparked internal reflection. Sources suggest that Harry began to reconsider his strategy, weighing the cost of defiance against the consequences of compliance. Friends, advisors, and allies debated options. Should he challenge the monarchy publicly, retreat to private life, or seek negotiation? Each path carried risk. Each decision could trigger escalation. The palace, meanwhile, maintained vigilance, ready to act if boundaries were crossed. The dynamic tension created a high-stakes environment in which even minor actions had significant implications. Importantly, the ultimatum set the stage for subsequent events that would dominate global headlines. It was no longer possible for Harry to operate with the relative freedom he once enjoyed. Privileges were stripped, behavior monitored, and consequences made clear. The environment was charged, public perception volatile, and personal relationships under strain. Advisors warned that even a single misstep could trigger a cascade of repercussions, both personal and institutional. Every subsequent chapter of Harry's life would unfold under this shadow, the ultimatum serving as a persistent reminder of authority, consequence, and expectation. The royal ultimatum was more than a warning. It was a pivot point. It crystallized the conflict between personal autonomy and institutional obligation, between family loyalty and public perception. It framed the narrative of Harry's actions not as isolated events, but as part of a larger drama in which choices, consequences, and legacy were inextricably linked. Every headline, every leak, every subsequent interaction would now be interpreted through this lens, amplifying the stakes and ensuring that the drama would continue to captivate global audiences. And as Harry left the meeting, advisors noted a subtle but significant shift. The realization that privilege and protection were conditional, that defiance carried real-world consequences, and that public perception mattered more than ever had sunk in. The stage was set for the next act of the unfolding saga, one that would escalate tensions, draw global attention, and ultimately redefine Harry's relationship with the monarchy and the UK itself. But even as the ultimatum was delivered, a subtle warning lingered in the background. One misstep, one unguarded statement, or one public defiance, and the consequences would go far beyond stripped privileges. The ultimatum was only the beginning. Once the royal ultimatum was delivered, the repercussions were not confined to the walls of the palace. They spilled into the court of public opinion, a court more unpredictable and merciless than any private confrontation could ever be. For centuries, the British monarchy has understood that perception is power. Public opinion can elevate or destroy reputations, shape narratives, and even influence the fate of titles and privileges. In Harry's case, the fallout was swift, brutal, and far-reaching. Within hours of initial reports about the ultimatum, social media erupted. Fans of Harry expressed outrage, rallying behind the narrative of a prince being punished for seeking autonomy and honesty. Critics, meanwhile, framed the story as evidence of reckless behavior, defiance, and the consequences of overstepping boundaries. Hashtags trended, memes circulated, and online debates escalated into full-blown digital battles. Public opinion was polarized, and the intensity of the reaction caught even palace insiders off guard. The media coverage amplified every nuance. Newspapers, news networks, and online publications dissected the ultimatum line by line, speculating about the tone, content, and implications. Headlines ranged from sympathetic to critical. Some emphasized Harry as a victim of an inflexible monarchy. Others portrayed him as a figure unable to accept responsibility. Each story reinforced the drama, creating a perception of crisis and tension that transcended traditional reporting. Analysts later noted that the coverage was unprecedented in scale, shaping the global narrative of Harry's conflict with the crown. Public opinion surveys reflected the intensity of the moment. Polls suggested growing divisions, with younger audiences expressing sympathy for Harry's desire for independence, while older or more traditional viewers sided with King Charles and the principles of protocol and duty. The palace, accustomed to measured criticism and controlled narratives, now faced a wildfire of perception that could not be contained. Every public statement, Every social media post and every appearance by Harry or the royal family was now scrutinized through this lens. The impact on Harry's personal brand was immediate. Privileges stripped, security restricted, and public opinion divided. He found himself navigating an environment in which every action carried amplified meaning. Supporters rallied online, fundraising campaigns and fan initiatives emerged, and sympathetic narratives gained traction. Yet every expression of defiance or critique of the monarchy risked backlash, scrutiny, and further erosion of credibility. Harry's personal choices were no longer private. They were public spectacles with potential global repercussions. The palace monitored public reaction closely. Advisors conducted detailed analyses of media coverage, social media sentiment, and international reporting. The objective was not only to understand perception, but to anticipate the next wave of public scrutiny. Every misstep by Harry could be leveraged to reinforce the monarchy's authority, while measured responses could shape the narrative in favor of tradition and duty. The interplay between private enforcement and public perception became a key tool in managing the crisis. Even minor leaks or rumors were amplified by public outrage. Reports of Harry seeking private meetings, making statements, or adjusting his schedule were scrutinized as evidence of defiance or remorse. Analysts noted the psychological pressure this created. A prince once insulated by privilege now faced global attention on every decision, every word, and every movement. Public opinion became both a battlefield and a constraint, forcing Harry to navigate carefully while the palace orchestrated its strategic responses. The polarization extended to international audiences. In the United States and other countries where Harry had built a public profile, narratives emphasized his desire for independence, transparency, and personal expression. Meanwhile, within the UK, traditionalist narratives framed the ultimatum as necessary, just, and consistent with centuries of protocol. The global spotlight intensified the stakes, turning private family matters into a spectacle with cultural, political, and symbolic significance. Harry's actions were interpreted not just as personal choices, but as emblematic of broader tensions between modernity, autonomy, and tradition. The fallout also reshaped relationships within Harry's circle. Allies, advisors, and friends who had previously acted with discretion now faced public scrutiny themselves. Every decision to defend, advise, or comment on Harry's behalf was amplified and analyzed. Some supporters urged bold public statements. Others cautioned restraint. This dynamic created internal tension, forcing Harry to balance loyalty, strategy, and personal expression under conditions of intense external pressure. Critically, public opinion influenced the palace's subsequent actions. The monarchy operates not only on protocol, but on perception. The reaction of the public, media, and international observers informed decisions about further privilege revocations, access restrictions, and potential public statements. Advisors noted that the palace could not act in isolation. Public sentiment, whether supportive or critical, shaped the context in which authority was asserted. The ultimatum, therefore, was only part of a broader strategy that integrated both private enforcement and public optics. Harry's own response to the fallout was complex. Sources suggest he oscillated between frustration, defiance, and strategic calculation. The polarized public opinion created both opportunity and risk. Supportive narratives could be leveraged for influence and advocacy, while criticism could exacerbate isolation and threaten further consequences. Every choice became high stakes, requiring careful assessment of timing, tone, and audience. The psychological weight of this scrutiny added an additional layer of complexity to an already tense situation. The palace, meanwhile, strategically managed appearances to maintain authority and mitigate further escalation. Public statements emphasized the need for loyalty, responsibility, and adherence to protocol. Subtle messaging reinforced that privileges were conditional and that consequences were real and enforceable. Every appearance by King Charles, senior royals, and advisors was meticulously planned to convey stability, authority, and resolve, counterbalancing the chaotic narrative generated by leaks and public debate. The intensity of the fallout reached its peak when social media narratives collided with traditional media coverage. Viral posts, opinion pieces, and televised commentary created a feedback loop of outrage, support, and speculation. For Harry, this environment was both exhausting and constraining. Every personal decision, private conversation, and public appearance was now magnified, interpreted, and scrutinized in ways that blurred the line between personal choice and public consequence. The psychological toll of this visibility was enormous, amplifying the pressure already imposed by stripped privileges and the royal ultimatum. Yet, even amid this turmoil, the drama was far from concluded. Public opinion, while volatile, is inherently dynamic. Shifts in perception, new revelations, or additional leaks could swing narratives, influence decisions, and reshape the unfolding story. The monarchy understood this and continued to monitor, strategize, and respond, ensuring that authority, protocol, and perception remained aligned. For Harry, navigating these fluctuating currents became an ongoing challenge, one in which missteps could trigger further consequences, and every move was potentially decisive. The fallout in public opinion was therefore more than a reaction. It was a force shaping both strategy and behavior. Harry's actions, previously managed through privilege, security, and private negotiation, were now filtered through a lens of global perception. The pressure to act, respond, and justify choices intensified, creating a high-stakes environment in which every decision carried amplified significance. Every leak, every headline, and every viral post was now part of the story, part of a public trial in which Harry's fate would be interpreted, debated, and judged. As the days passed, it became clear that public opinion would play a central role in the monarchy's next moves. The ultimatum, stripped privileges, and private confrontations had set the stage, but the court of public perception would amplify, interpret, and, in some cases, punish in ways no internal palace deliberation could control. Harry's world had shifted. He was no longer just a prince within the royal institution. He was a public figure navigating a complex, unforgiving landscape of opinion, expectation, and consequence. By the time public opinion had erupted and the royal ultimatum was known, the palace had already begun preparing the next phase of its response, a strategic, calculated approach that combined legal authority with financial oversight. In any monarchy, privileges are not merely ceremonial. They are intertwined with resources, security, and influence. For Harry, this meant that the next set of consequences would not only affect status and perception, but also impact tangible assets, protections, and legal standing. The first move involved a careful review of Harry's existing privileges, trusts, and entitlements. Legal advisors within the